The fluorescent lights hummed above the parking lot as Margaret Walsh pulled into Cedar Creek Medical at 11:44 p.m., her hand steady on the steering wheel, her breathing the kind of slow and deliberate rhythm that came from 23 years of walking into places where people were falling apart. The night shift. Always the night shift. She'd requested it 6 months ago, and the hospital had been grateful. Nobody wanted those hours, that skeletal staffing, that weight of silence broken only by monitors and the occasional code blue that made everyone move like they'd rehearsed it 1,000 times. Which they had. Her scrubs were pressed with military precision, the seams running true along her shoulders, and she moved through the emergency department in trance with the kind of invisibility that only came from decades of practice. Not hiding. Never hiding. Just occupying space in a way that made people's eyes slide past her like she was part of the architecture, like she was a beige wall or a supply cart that had learned to walk. The badge clipped to her pocket read Margaret Walsh, RN, Cedar Creek Medical, and nothing else. No credentials. No history. No mention of the 3-field surgery she'd performed on her knees in the dust outside Fallujah, or the way she could thread and for in pitch darkness using only her hands, or the reason her left shoulder carried that stiffness when she reached for anything above her head. The night shift nurse station was quiet at midnight, just the way she preferred it. 2 nurses charting at the main desk, both of them shifting in their seats as she approached the medication dispensary, both of them suddenly finding reasons to be somewhere else within 30 seconds. People did that around Margaret. Not because she was cold, she wasn't. Not because she was unfriendly. But because there was something in the way she moved, something in the flatness of her grey eyes, something that made people understand on an animal level that this was a woman who had already survived things that would break ordinary people. So they didn't try to befriend her. They didn't invite her to happy hour. They didn't ask about her weekend plans. She had become, quite deliberately, the kind of person you work beside without actually knowing. She logged into the computer system with her credentials and pulled up the night assignment. Room 347. Room 349. Room 351. The colonel in 347 was her anchor point tonight, the reason she was here, the reason she'd volunteered for Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah 6 months ago when the Pentagon's logistics officer had slid a folder across a desk and said, "We need someone in that hospital for 48 hours a week. Long term. Deep cover. Can you do isolated?" She could do isolated. Margaret made her way through the corridors with that same practiced invisibility, her shoes making almost no sound on the polished linoleum. The night shift hospital was a different creature than the day shift, darker in some ineffable way, quieter in a manner that made every beep of a monitor seem urgent, every call light feel like a small emergency waiting to happen. She passed the supply closets, the break room where the coffee maker gurgled its 2 a.m. rotation, the waiting area where a family slept across 3 chairs with their heads at angles that would leave them sore in the morning. The fluorescent lights buzzed their constant mechanical song, a sound she'd learned to filter out somewhere around hour 4 of her first night shift, back when she was still 24 and didn't know yet that she'd never really sleep again, not the way normal people did. Room 347 was quiet. She pushed the door open with her hip, the hinges moving soundlessly because she'd already oiled them during her second week here, and looked at the man in the bed. Colonel James Hatcher. Air Force. 63 years old. Admitted 3 days ago with a perforated ulcer that had required surgery, a repair that Dr. Mercer had handled with competent hands but a mind already calculating how many billing codes he could justify to the insurance company. The colonel was sleeping, his face slack with the weight of morphine, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical steadiness of a man whose body was still healing from trauma. 2 full lines running. 1 for fluids, 1 for antibiotics. Heart monitor showing a sinus rhythm that had improved in the last 12 hours from an irregular flutter to something almost normal. Oxygen saturation at 97%. Blood pressure 118/72. Stable. Getting better. The kind of trajectory that meant he'd be transferred to a regular room by morning, discharged within the week, back to whatever Air Force administrative role had brought him to Savannah in the first place. Margaret didn't let her eyes linger on his face. Not in that way. She approached the 4 lines with the movements of someone who had performed this task 10,000 times, checking the bags for cloudiness, verifying the drip rates against the orders, ensuring that nothing had kinked or infiltrated. Her hands moved with a kind of surgical precision that came from muscle memory so deep it was almost automatic. 14 years as a field medic. 9 years as a trauma nurse. This was rhythm. This was language. This was the only place where her hands had ever felt like they truly belonged. The colonel's chest rose and fell. The monitor beeped its steady electronic pulse. Margaret checked the dressing at his surgical site, noting the absence of any seeping, any odor, any sign of infection. Good. Better than good. The kind of healing that meant his immune system was doing what it was supposed to do, his body remembering how to repair itself after the trauma of the blade and the stitches and the morphine that was currently keeping him in a place where he didn't have to remember anything at all. She was about to turn to leave when something made her pause. A moment. Just a fraction of a second. The way her eyes tracked across his forearm as she adjusted the blanket, the way her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when she saw the tattoo there. Walsh. Just that one word, inked in blue-black letters along his inner forearm, the kind of tattoo that military men got when something had changed them. When someone had saved their life. When they wanted to carry that memory forward in their skin. She had not allowed herself to think about Sergeant Marcus Ramos in 6 months. She did not think about him now. She simply checked the call button, ensured it was within his reach, and left the room with the same quiet efficiency with which she'd entered it. Behind her, the colonel slept on in his morphine-induced haze, unaware that the grey-haired nurse who had just touched his 4 lines was the same woman who'd held his bleeding body against her chest in the dust outside Baghdad, who'd kept her hands on the hole in his stomach while RPG fire ripped through the compound, who'd used a combat knife and surgical string to close a thoracotomy wound because there was no operating room, no anesthesia, nothing but her hands and 23 years of refusing to let people die on her watch. He had no idea she was here. No idea the Pentagon had placed her on this unit specifically to watch over him while he recovered from his civilian injury, to ensure that whatever he'd seen in Baghdad, the thing that made him a key witness in a classified Air Force investigation, stayed protected from the enemies who'd already tried twice to silence him. He had no idea that the invisible nurse checking his vitals at midnight was operating under orders that existed in a file folder marked above top secret, or that every chart she reviewed, every medication she dispensed, every moment she spent in this hospital was part of a military operation that existed in the spaces between official records. She made her way to the break room at 1:15 a.m., the dead zone of the night shift when everyone was running on fumes and coffee and the kind of desperation that only came from knowing there were still 5 hours of darkness left to survive. Her lunch was already there in the refrigerator, a container of grilled chicken and vegetables that she'd prepared on Sunday with the precision of someone who understood that fuel was information, that her body was a tool that required maintenance. She pulled it out, found a chair at the small table near the window, and began to eat with quiet, methodical movements. Within 90 seconds, Nurse Patterson gathered her things. Within 2 minutes, Nurse Jen stood up and relocated her coffee to the hallway. Within 3 minutes, Margaret was alone in the break room, which was exactly how she preferred it. People could sense things about her. Some people could sense that this was a woman who had seen things. That this was a woman who could kill them with her bare hands if she needed to. That this was a woman who had already died once and come back different, come back wrong, come back in a shape that no longer quite fit into civilian spaces. She ate her chicken. She drank her water. She opened the digital patient chart system on the break room computer and began her real work. The billing codes. That was what she was here to document. That was the secondary mission that had evolved over the last 6 months as she'd begun to notice patterns in Dr. Mercer's procedures, inconsistencies in his surgical reports, charges that didn't quite match the documented procedures. A cholecystectomy billed as an exploratory laparotomy. A standard appendectomy charged as an emergency resection with complications. A perforated ulcer repair, the Colonel's surgery, documented as requiring 3 additional procedures that Margaret could find no evidence of in either the operative notes or the anesthesia records. She had been documenting it all. Every code. Every discrepancy. Every instance where Mercer's greed had outrun his competence. The Pentagon didn't care about hospital billing fraud, not ordinarily. But when the person managing that fraud was close enough to a classified witness to potentially become a security liability, when that person might be approached by foreign actors looking for leverage, for information, for a way to get close to the colonel, then even civilian crimes became matters of national security. Margaret had been building a file. 6 months of spreadsheets and screenshots, all stored in an encrypted partition that only 2 other people in the world could access. She had documented at least $400,000 in fraudulent charges. She had created a map of Mercer's methods, his patterns, his vulnerabilities. And she had done it all while being the invisible nurse that nobody noticed, the one that people forgot the moment she left the room, the one that nobody would ever suspect of having the technical knowledge or institutional access to build this kind of case. The break room clock showed 1:06 a.m. when she heard the footsteps in the hallway, the distinctive walk of someone moving with purpose, with anger barely contained beneath the surface. Dr. Mercer. She recognized the cadence of his shoes on the linoleum, the way his breathing carried just a fraction of audible tension. He passed the break room without looking in, but she felt the moment he understood she was there. Felt the moment his jaw tightened. Felt the moment his hands clenched slightly at his sides. He knew she was reviewing the charts. He didn't know how much she'd found, but he knew enough to be nervous. Margaret closed out the patient system, finished her water, and returned her container to the refrigerator. By the time she left the break room, Dr. Mercer was 3 corridors away, already mentally calculating what he could do about the nurse who'd suddenly become a liability, already beginning to formulate the strategies that would escalate over the coming days. He didn't know yet that she was military. He didn't know yet that she had spent 2 decades in places where the stakes were measured in lives and consequences came swift and absolute. He just knew that she was a threat. And threats, in Dr. Mercer's experience, could usually be eliminated with the right combination of authority and institutional power. The shift change at 3 o'clock was deliberate. Dr. Mercer waited until the hallway filled with the incoming afternoon staff, nurses moving between rooms with fresh energy, visitors arriving with flowers and guilt. Margaret stood at the nurse's station reviewing the colonel's chart, her finger tracing the careful notes she'd documented through the night: respiration rate stable, pain management effective, no signs of infection. The chart was perfect because her work was perfect. That was always the problem. Nurse Walsh. Dr. Mercer's voice cut across the station like a blade. He stood with the chief nursing officer, his expression arranged into something that looked like concern but felt like a predator identifying weakness. Your documentation practices have been flagged. Again. Margaret looked up. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the kind of restraint that came from having already survived worse than a surgeon's contempt. She waited for him to continue, her silence a wall. I don't know what standards they had wherever you worked before, he continued, loud enough for the crowded hallway to hear, but Cedar Creek expects precision. Not creative interpretations. He turned to the unit board, the one visible to every staff member passing through, and pinned a bright yellow write-up beneath her name. The paper seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights like a scarlet letter. This is the 4th documented deviation from protocol this month. The lie was perfect. There had been no deviations. There had been excellence, the kind of quiet, meticulous excellence that saved lives and prevented infections and caught the small signs that separated recovery from catastrophe. But excellence in a subordinate was a threat to mediocrity in power, and Dr. Mercer could not tolerate threats. Margaret's cold, flat stare met his eyes for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for him to register that something in her had shifted, that the mild night shift nurse he thought he'd intimidated was still present but no longer afraid. Then she spoke, her voice low and even, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Your hands were shaking during the gallbladder procedure this morning. Maybe you should sit down before you hurt someone. The hallway went so quiet you could hear the ventilator from room 342 wheeze its mechanical rhythm through the open doorway. Dr. Mercer's face flushed the color of old brick. His mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating in air. But Margaret had already turned, her footsteps measured and even as she walked past him toward the patient rooms, leaving him red-faced in front of the chief nursing officer and 3 incoming nurses who suddenly became very interested in their clipboards. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It was the beginning of something worse for him. 20 minutes later, Margaret was in room 347 with the colonel and his daughter, a woman in her 50s with his same sharp cheekbones and a worried crease between her eyes. The colonel was disoriented from the morning morphine, his arm moving restlessly, and Margaret noticed the foresight immediately. The infiltration was causing the line to pull with each movement, tissue swelling beginning around the catheter. Tissue damage. A potential infection vector. She moved with fluid precision, repositioning the line with her fingertips, securing it properly, checking the flow rate. The daughter watched, relief crossing her face as the colonel's arm relaxed. The door burst open. Dr. Mercer stood in the doorway like a man constructed from pure rage, his presence making the air pressure change, making the room feel smaller. "Nurse Walsh, you were explicitly instructed to notify a physician before ANY intervention with this patient." His voice was knife-sharp. "Are you incapable of following simple protocols, or do you just enjoy playing doctor? Perhaps Charity Case here thinks the rules don't apply to her." The colonel's daughter stared at him in confusion. The colonel himself was too medicated to register the words, but the tone landed, ugly, contemptuous, designed to humiliate. Margaret waited until Mercer finished his tirade, her expression like carved ice, untouchable and distant. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more devastating. The infiltration was causing tissue damage. I prioritized the patient's welfare over your ego. She turned and walked past him without another word, her shoulders level, her gait unhurried. Behind her, she heard the colonel's daughter say quietly, "That was unprofessional," and then, confused, "Who even was that?" The colonel didn't answer, already drifting back into morphine-hazed silence. By midnight, the third humiliation had been carefully choreographed by institutional gossip. Margaret sat alone at the corner table in the break room, her reheated pasta cooling in front of her under the fluorescent lights that buzzed like dying insects. She was reading an article on her phone about new antibiotic resistance patterns, the kind of thing a real nurse read during breaks, the kind of thing no one else at Cedar Creek seemed to care about. 4 nurses entered, their voices bright with laughter, but the moment they saw Margaret they gathered their things like a coordinated withdrawal. One of them, Bethany from the day shift, turned to whisper to another, just loud enough to carry, "I heard she got fired from her last 2 hospitals. Apparently there were some psych issues. That's why she works nights." The lie was beautiful in its simplicity. No one questioned it. No one asked for verification. No one cared that Margaret had 13 years of spotless employment record spanning 3 continents, that her last position had been terminated only because her orders had changed, that her psychiatric clearance was compartmentalized and classified at a level that would make the Pentagon weep. To the day shift at Cedar Creek, she was just the strange night shift nurse. The quiet one. The one who ate alone and never smiled and had something wrong with her. Margaret didn't look up from her phone. But her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, just enough that someone trained to read micro-expressions, someone who had been taught to read survival in the distance between a heartbeat and the next, would have noticed something shift. She set down her fork carefully and closed her phone and sat in silence for the remainder of her break, the folded flag of her fallen teammate Ramos still tucked in her jacket pocket where it had been since Fallujah, 14 years ago, when she had been someone else entirely. When she had carried 3 wounded soldiers through hostile fire in a Baghdad neighborhood where the air smelled like copper and burning diesel and where a young Marine named Ramos had given her his blood type and his prayers and eventually his life. She pressed her hand briefly against a scar hidden beneath her scrubs, just above her ribs, a touch of tenderness that lasted only a moment, only when the world wasn't watching. At 2:17 a.m., Margaret conducted her routine vital signs check on room 347. The colonel's respiration was steady at 16 breaths per minute, his oxygen saturation holding at 98%, his morphine levels precisely calibrated to manage pain without compromising alertness. She documented everything in her encrypted personal log, the one Mercer didn't know existed, the one that had been synced to Pentagon servers for 6 months, updating in real time with every billing code she'd documented, every insurance claim inflated by phantom procedures, every transaction that tied Dr. Mercer to a defense contractor named Valdez Industries. The colonel was the key witness. The cornerstone. A fighter pilot who had discovered the kickback scheme while processing maintenance contracts, who had gone to the wrong command initially and had his concerns buried, who had finally reached out to Air Force Special Investigations. The network behind it was worth $2.3 million annually, enough money to make a surgeon with a gambling problem and a third ex-wife's alimony payments very motivated to ensure certain witnesses never made it to a courtroom. At 2:41 a.m., Margaret noticed something that made her training sing to life. The security camera in the colonel's hallway had been repositioned. The new angle missed the room entrance entirely. She keyed her radio to call security, but the channel was dead, manually disabled from the main desk, which meant someone with badge access had planned this carefully. She moved without hesitation, without the luxury of fear. She positioned a crash cart as a barrier in the doorway, moved to the colonel's bedside, and checked his for access with practiced fingers. 16-gauge angiocouth, secure, patent. She ran her hands across his arm, checking for any sign of infiltration, any weakness that would compromise his care in the next few minutes. Because she knew, in the way that soldiers know, that the next few minutes would require everything. At 2:43 a.m., 2 men emerged from the stairwell. Margaret saw them through the interior window of room 347, the way they moved, the tactical precision, the suppressed weapons held with the casual competence of professionals. Not hospital security. Not police response. This was different. This was a contract. She moved on instinct, muscle memory taking over. She shoved the colonel's bed toward the door, using her body as a block, and the first suppressed shots punctured the four-stand with 3 wet, whistling sounds. Saline sprayed across the floor like rain on hot asphalt. Pain. White hot. Explosive. The first bullet tore through her left shoulder, through muscle and bone, and she gasped but didn't move, didn't retreat, threw herself across the colonel's chest instead, using her body as a shield. The second round ripped through her side below the ribs, and she felt her own blood begin to spread across her scrubs, warm and foreign and somehow not real because the training overrode everything. The third bullet grazed her thigh. She kicked the call button repeatedly, screaming, "Code Silver, room 347, into the suddenly screaming alarms, and somewhere in the back of her mind that was still calculating, still trained, she thought, the Pentagon had 48 hours to reach them before the hospital's security protocols locked down the building. 48 hours before everyone realized what had happened here. 48 hours before Dr. Mercer's world ended. But that wasn't the worst part. At 2:17 a.m., Margaret stood at the threshold of room 347 with her encrypted field log, the kind of midnight routine that no one noticed, no one cared about. The colonel slept beneath a thin hospital blanket, his chest rising and falling with the metronome regularity of a man whose morphine drip was perfectly calibrated. She checked the bag, 250 milliliters remaining, noted it in her log with the clinical precision of someone who had monitored vital fluids in far worse conditions, and that was when she heard it. The sound didn't belong. Boots on tile. Too synchronized. Too controlled. The cadence of tactical movement, 1, 2, 3, coming down the north corridor, the one that bypassed the main nursing station. Her body went rigid. Not a code blue. Not an emergency transport. This was the sound of a breach, the unmistakable rhythm of a coordinated entry team moving with the kind of rehearsed silence that only came from 3-month deployments and killhouse drills. The fluorescent light above her hummed its mechanical drone, indifferent to the fact that Margaret's hand was already moving toward the door. She had maybe 8 seconds. The stairwell door at the end of the hall opened with the softest whisper of hinged metal. 2 figures emerged. Dark tactical vests. Suppressors screwed onto the barrels of their weapons like executioners checking their tools. They moved with the fluid precision of apex predators, the kind of synchronized violence that Margaret recognized the way other people recognized their own reflection. She knew the gait. Knew the gear. Knew the intent before they ever touched the door handle to room 347. Margaret didn't think. Thinking was for civilians. Her body had its own memory. She grabbed the bedrail of the colonel's hospital bed with both hands and yanked. The wheel screamed, a sound like metal wrenching against physics, and she drove him toward the door frame just as the first suppressed shots cut through the air where his chest had been milliseconds before. The four-stand exploded in a spray of plastic and fluid, the bag punctured, bleeding clear liquid across the white tile. Pop, pop, pop. 3 shots. Clinical. Precise. Professional. The colonel's eyes snapped open, confusion and morphine fighting for control of his expression, but Margaret was already moving. She threw herself across his torso as the second wave came through the window, her left shoulder taking the first round with the blunt force of a sledgehammer against bone. The pain was enormous and clean, a data point, a trajectory, a message that said *, you are hit *, and she didn't stop moving. Her hands found the bed frame. Her body became a shield, all 130 pounds of deliberately positioned muscle and scar tissue between a man and the business end of a suppressed weapon. The second bullet tore through her right side, just below her ribs, the kind of wound that made breathing an afterthought and thinking a luxury she couldn't afford. Blood soaked through her scrubs, warm and heavy, but her grip on the bed rail didn't loosen. Her jaw clenched, that was all. One flexing of muscle at the hinge of her face. That was all the pain got. The tactical team was already repositioning, moving to clear angles, and Margaret's eyes found what she needed, the call button anchored to the bedside rail, 6 inches from her right hand. The third shot came and grazed the outside of her thigh, tearing scrubs and flesh in a line of fire that felt like someone had run a branding iron across her leg. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out. Instead, she moved her leg, a simple muscular action, and brought her foot up in a driving kick toward the alarm. The button connected. The alarm shrieked like a banshee. And then the world inverted. Security flooded the hallway in 90 seconds, the response time to a trauma alert, tactical enough to suggest someone had been briefed, institutional enough to suggest the Pentagon had quietly modified Cedar Creek's lockdown protocols months ago. Margaret never lifted her eyes from the colonel as they moved her onto a gurney, as someone was shouting about blood loss, as the tactical team evaporated into the stairwell like they'd never existed at all. Her hand remained in its grip on the bed rail until the colonel's eyes met hers one more time and she saw something break through the morphine haze. Recognition? Gratitude? The light dimmed again before she could tell. They lifted her away. Pain became the world. Blood loss became mathematics, rate of flow, tissue damage, shock threshold. She focused on breathing, on keeping her hand pressed against the wound in her side where the exit was larger than the entrance, which meant internal damage she couldn't assess from the outside. Compound fracture potential in the shoulder where the bullet had entered. Significant muscular trauma in the thigh. Survivable wounds. The kind she'd seen soldiers walk away from in Baghdad, the kind she'd inflicted herself in situations where survival meant being the last person standing. The corridor blurred past. Someone was shouting her name. Someone else was starting a second full line. She felt the stick, the flash of the catheter, the hiss of pressure. Sinus rhythm. Stable for now. The fluorescent light streaked overhead like a runway leading somewhere she'd already been, somewhere in the past tense, somewhere that didn't matter anymore because the colonel was alive and the threat was contained and that was the mission. Then Mercer appeared. He stood at the intersection of the north corridor and the main hall, his hair disheveled, his expression cycling through confusion and calculation at the speed of a man whose carefully constructed world had just developed cracks. He saw Margaret bleeding. He saw the tactical response. He saw opportunity. She watched his face shift. It was like watching a predator recognize wounded prey, except the wounded prey was already moving, already thinking, already 3 steps ahead of whatever he was about to do. His eyes went to the police officers who'd arrived with the security team, and Margaret saw the calculation complete itself before he opened his mouth. He approached them with the measured concern of a man of authority, and his voice came soft and pedagogical, the tone of a senior physician sharing troubling observations with junior colleagues. Officers, he began, and Margaret's vision narrowed, everything else falling away except the shape of his mouth and the angle of his posture. I need to report something. Nurse Walsh has been written up multiple times for erratic behavior. Unauthorized patient contact. Protocol violations. He paused, letting that land. Her presence during a security event is highly suspicious. I've documented concerns about her stability in her personnel file. The officers exchanged glances. Mercer had the leverage of a chief of surgery, the institutional authority that made him credible, and they were already moving in her direction before he even finished speaking. He wasn't done. I'm worried she may have staged this, he continued, his voice carrying across the hallway with the precision of someone used to being heard. We found discrepancies in medication logs she was responsible for. I have to wonder if this incident is cover for something else. They approached her gurney. One of them looked genuinely concerned. The other looked like he was doing his job. Margaret lay there with blood soaking through 2 layers of trauma dressings, with her shoulder screaming and her side screaming and her leg screaming, and she stared at Mercer with a kind of calm that comes from having looked down the barrel of worse than this. Then she spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried. You made 3 phone calls tonight before the shooting, she said. Want me to list the numbers? Mercer's face went pale. The officers turned back toward him. The moment stretched like pulled glass, fragile and sharp, and Margaret watched the calculation restart in his eyes, the realization that she'd been documenting far more than just medication logs, that the quiet nurse had been listening to everything, that his careful power structure had been observed from the ground up by someone whose job was to see exactly these things. She allowed the officers to escort her toward the emergency department, her hand pressed against her bleeding side, her breathing measured and controlled despite the fact that she could feel blood pooling in places it shouldn't be. The folded flag from Ramos remained in her jacket pocket, protected by her body in the same way her body had protected the colonel. Some things you didn't lose. Some things you carried to the end. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical hum. The hospital continued its ordered chaos. And somewhere above Cedar Creek Medical in the dark Savannah night, a phone was ringing in the Pentagon. Dr. Mercer arrived during the lockdown at 2:58 a.m., his surgical mask hanging around his neck, his hand still trembling from the adrenaline of being ushered to safety. He saw her then, Margaret, collapsed halfway across the colonel's bed, her left shoulder dark with blood, her side seeping through white cotton that had turned crimson in the fluorescent glare. Her body was a shield. The realization hit him like a physical blow, but not the kind that brought respect. It brought opportunity. Security was still establishing the perimeter. Officers in tactical vests moved through the hallway with practiced precision, radios crackling with codes Margaret didn't need translated. She was already on her feet by the time Mercer pushed into the room, her right hand steady on the forestand even as her left arm hung useless at her side. She didn't ask for help. She didn't acknowledge the pain, and there was pain, the kind that radiated like hot iron through muscle and bone, but her face remained flat as glass. That woman, Mercer said to the nearest police officer, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry authority. She's been written up repeatedly for erratic behavior. Multiple incidents. Violation of protocols. He gestured toward Margaret as if she were evidence of a crime. Her presence here during a security event is highly suspicious. I want her removed from the premises immediately. The officer, a sergeant with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, turned to Margaret with professional neutrality. I'm going to need you to step away from the patient. The patient needs continuous monitoring, Margaret said. Her voice didn't shake. It never did. His four is compromised. His post-op from a procedure this morning and... Step away from the patient, the sergeant repeated, this time with the weight of official protocol behind it. Mercer smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just watched his problems solve themselves. He pulled out his phone, already composing the narrative in his mind, of the suspicious nurse, the security breach, the convenient coincidence of her presence. By tomorrow morning, he would have a story shaped like truth, polished smooth by repetition and institutional weight. He had done this before. He would do it again. Margaret moved away from the bed with deliberate slowness, keeping her right hand visible, her movements signaling compliance even as her eyes never left the Colonel's face. The monitors continued their rhythmic beeping, sinus rhythm, steady, good, but she was already calculating what would happen without her there to track the subtle changes, the small deviations that meant something was beginning to fail. 2 officers escorted her out, one on each side, their hands not quite touching her but close enough to prevent escape. She didn't resist. Resistance would have confirmed Mercer's narrative. Instead, she moved like someone who understood the weight of institutional authority, who had learned decades ago that fighting systems was a losing game. Her bandaged left arm throbbed with each step. The bullet that had passed through her shoulder had missed the brachial artery by perhaps half an inch. She had known this the moment the pain registered as localized rather than systemic. Training. Experience. Damage assessment in the space between heartbeats. As they descended the stairwell, the elevator was being held for emergency personnel. She understood what Mercer had actually accomplished. 6 months. 6 months of careful positioning, of invisible work, of being the one person in Cedar Creek Medical who could read the Colonel's physiology like a book written in his own blood and breath. 6 months of documenting every one of Mercer's coded billing entries, every inflated charge, every insurance claim that didn't quite match the procedures actually performed. And now, in a single act of calculated selfishness, Mercer had burned it all. The Colonel was exposed. The Pentagon knew he was a witness, that much was evident from the tactical team that had just tried to kill him. And now the only person with the operational clearance to protect him was being escorted out of the building by Savannah police officers who had no idea they were extracting a captain from one of the most classified protection details in the Department of Defense. The parking lot was cool and damp, the Savannah night pressing down like a weight. Margaret's breath came in measured increments as the officers placed her in the back of a patrol car, not arrested, technically, but transported. Removed. The distinction was academic. As they pulled away from Cedar Creek Medical, she watched the building recede in the rear window, watching for lights in the Colonel's room, watching for the monitors that would alarm if his condition deteriorated, watching for the moment when she would become useless because she was no longer there. At 3:47 a.m., Margaret sat in a fluorescent-lit diner 6 blocks from Cedar Creek, the only customer awake at this dead hour. The waitress had brought coffee without asking and then retreated to the kitchen, sensing something in the quiet woman's demeanor that discouraged conversation. Margaret's left arm rested in a makeshift sling. The hospital had provided gauze and tape, refusing to treat her injuries further after Mercer's intervention. The bandages were already beginning to seep. She had stopped checking how much blood. Her reflection stared back from the dark window, a ghost wearing her face. The coffee had gone cold beside her elbow, untouched. She could smell it though, bitter, acidic, human. Could smell the bleach from the hospital still embedded in her clothes, the antiseptic that never quite washed out of her skin no matter how many years passed. Could smell the rain beginning to fall outside, that particular Savannah rain that smelled like the river and ancient earth and things left buried too long. The folded flag sat on the table beside her phone. The flag from Ramos, her squad's communications specialist, who had died covering their retreat from a rooftop in Baghdad 6 years ago. She had held him while his blood transferred from his body to hers, had whispered things she didn't remember now, had folded the flag herself because nobody else had the right. It had lived in her jacket pocket every day since, not as a memorial, but as ballast. As proof that some things mattered more than career advancement or institutional safety or the accumulation of rank. Her phone buzzed at 3:53 a.m. The message came through encrypted channels, the kind that didn't leave traces on civilian networks, cover compromised. Extraction unavailable. Colonel witness status elevated priority. She closed her eyes. She had known this was coming. The moment Mercer made his call to the police, the moment the tactical team breached the room, the moment the first bullet had passed through the forestand and into the wall beyond it, she had known. 6 months of being invisible, of absorbing insults designed to isolate her, of documenting fraud while maintaining a patient's life was not a failure of duty. It was the completion of duty. The mission had always been finite. But she had not expected it to end with her forced removal, with the Colonel left alone and exposed. The waitress refilled her coffee cup without asking. Margaret's hands were steady as she picked it up, as she held the warm ceramic and watched the steam rise into the fluorescent air. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 6 years of Baghdad and the years after, all compressed into a single moment of absolute control. At 4:15 a.m., her phone rang. The encrypted line. A liaison from the Pentagon, his voice professional and measured. "Captain Walsh, we need you to stay away from Cedar Creek pending review." "That's an order." She hung up without responding. Orders were meant for people who had choices. She didn't have choices anymore. She had only obligations and the knowledge of what happened when you walked away from them. At 6 a.m., she walked back into Cedar Creek Medical through the emergency entrance, her credentials still technically active, her badge clipped to the waistband of her scrubs despite the fact that she was no longer employed. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical greeting. The smell of antiseptic wrapped around her like something familiar. The triage nurse looked up and then looked away, understanding instinctively that this woman was not a person to be engaged. Dr. Mercer spotted her immediately. He was in the hallway outside the colonel's room, his white coat crisp and freshly pressed, his expression arranged in the kind of satisfaction that comes from a problem solving itself. He stepped toward her, his voice rising. "Security. I want her removed. She's been terminated effective immediately for violation of security protocols and insubordination." Margaret ignored him completely. She walked past as if he were furniture, as if he were nothing. She walked straight to room 347 where 2 private security contractors in dark suits now stood watch over the colonel. His eyes were still heavily sedated, but she could see from the monitor that his oxygen saturation had dipped to 91% during the night, not critical, but declining. Without intervention, that would continue the downward trajectory. She told the contractors, "Those men will try again. And he's helping them." She pointed at Mercer without turning to look at him. The contractors didn't move to stop her as she slipped past them into the room. She didn't touch the colonel. She just checked the 4-line, adjusted the oxygen delivery, verified that his medications were still flowing in the correct sequence. 30 seconds. That's all it took. Then she turned and walked back out. Security escorted her toward the exit, but not before she slipped a USB drive into the pocket of a night shift nurse, a woman named Patricia who had never joined the others in their exile at lunch, who had brought her soup once when Mercer wasn't watching. Margaret leaned close and whispered, "Federal Prosecutor, Atlanta office. Agent Chen. Everything's on there." The night was still dark as they walked her to the parking lot. Behind her, Cedar Creek Medical hummed with the quiet urgency of a hospital saving lives. Somewhere in that building, a colonel was being protected by people she would never meet, people whose names she would never know, people who would do what needed to be done because it was their job to do it. Margaret drove to the diner. She ordered coffee. She waited. The folded flag rested on the table beside her phone, and this time she did not touch it. Instead, she watched the sky lighten from black to gray to the particular shade of blue that came just before dawn, and she understood that everything had changed in the time it took for bullets to find their targets. 48 hours. That was all it took for the Pentagon to decide Savannah's weather. 2 men in charcoal suits walked into Cedar Creek Medical at 7:24 a.m., their credentials flickering past security before anyone had time to ask questions. Behind them came a woman with silver hair and a radio clipped to her belt. Behind her came 3 more, moving with the specific kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't need to. The air pressure in the lobby changed when they entered, the way it changes before a storm breaks. Dr. Mercer was still signing off on charts. Still believing the previous night had been a simple shooting, a random act, a tragedy that would fade into the background noise of a hospital where people died every day. He had already drafted the narrative, a disturbed nurse, suspicious behavior, a patient caught in crossfire. The police had been sympathetic. Insurance companies understood these things. One incident report and Margaret Walsh would be a problem solved, a loose end tied off, a resume gap explained away with a note about mental health concerns. He was turning the corner toward the physician's lounge when one of the suits appeared in his path like a door slamming shut. Dr. Marcus Mercer. I'm Special Agent Valencia with the Department of Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. We need to speak with you about Room 347 and your role in compromising a federal protection operation. The color drained from Mercer's face like water from a tub someone had just pulled the plug on. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. What? I haven't, that patient was a random admission. I have no idea. The assault was coordinated through encrypted communications on a phone registered to your name. The contract terms were discussed in emails we recovered from the defense contractor's servers. The payment structure was $15,000 monthly, deposited to an account in the Cayman Islands. Shall I continue, or would you like to consult an attorney first? The hallway was filling now. Nurses stepping out of patient rooms. A resident frozen mid-conversation. A phlebotomist holding a tray of collection tubes like they might explode. Everyone watching. Everyone recording on phones that had already begun humming with the electric current of catastrophe spreading through a network. That was when the colonel's door opened. He rolled past in a wheelchair, still favoring his left side, still moving like a man reassembling himself piece by piece. His eyes found Margaret, standing between two federal agents in pressed uniforms. He saw the bandage visible beneath her unbuttoned collar, the way she held her left arm against her body, the slight wince when she shifted her weight. His lips moved. 3 syllables, barely audible over the hum of fluorescent lights and distant machines. Iron sighed. Her head turned. For one moment, just one, something ancient flickered across her face. Recognition. Acknowledgement. The weight of 6 years compressed into the space between a heartbeat and breath. Then her composure settled back into place, that smooth professional surface that had fooled everyone for 6 months. But the colonel had seen it. He had whispered it in a Baghdad hospital tent when bullets were still singing through the air outside, when her hands were steady on his chest and his vision was tunneling and the only thing keeping him tethered to the world was the sound of her voice saying his name. Iron sighed. That was what they called her then. That was what the unit called anyone who walked through fire without breaking. A Marine officer stepped forward, reading from a leather portfolio. His voice was the color of brass, measured and official and carrying the weight of institutions that did not question. Captain Margaret Ellen Walsh. Silver Star. Citation reads, for conspicuous gallantry in action while assigned to Joint Special Operations Task Force, Anbar Province, Iraq. Captain Walsh maintained protective fire over 3 wounded coalition personnel while moving through active hostile territory, absorbing fragmentation wounds to the abdomen and left femur while successfully extracting all personnel to secure location. Her actions prevented loss of life in an environment where survival was not a certainty. The hospital lobby had gone so quiet you could hear the rain starting outside, a sound like distant applause building toward something inevitable. A 2-star general entered through the main entrance, rain darkening his dress blues across the shoulders. His rank insignia caught the light like twin stars burned into brass. He surveyed the scene, the agents, the crowd, the colonel in the wheelchair, Margaret standing with her arm in a sling and her face as still as a marble statue. He approached her slowly, deliberately, the way a warrior moves through sacred space. And then he came to attention. His hand rose, not in the casual salute of a hallway greeting, but in the formal, sustained gesture of respect given to those who have earned it in blood and silence. The decoration she wore on her chest, the ones no one at Cedar Creek Medical could have known were there, the one she had never been authorized to display in public, he acknowledged each one by looking directly at them, by making them matter, by saying without words that he knew exactly what they had cost. Captain Walsh, he said. Welcome home. Behind her, the swell of people began to move, some stepping closer, phones still raised, the moment already being sealed into digital amber. A nurse with a camera was live-streaming to social media, narrating in disbelief. The general's presence. The colonel's recognition. The quiet woman who had worked nights for 6 months pushing through their collective understanding of who she was supposed to be. The comments were already appearing, faster than thought. Is this real? That's a 2-star. What hospital is this? Oh my God, that's a silver star. Dr. Mercer pushed through the crowd, his face flushed red now, his voice climbing toward something that sounded like panic wrapped in professional outrage. This is a completely unacceptable breach of hospital protocol. I don't care what federal agency you represent, you cannot simply waltz into my hospital and conduct military ceremonies without administrative approval. There are regulations, there are procedures. The Pentagon liaison stepped forward. She was younger than Mercer expected, with the kind of eyes that had seen documents marked at classifications he would never have access to. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried the specific gravity of someone who had never been questioned in her professional life and saw no reason to expect it now. Dr. Marcus Mercer, you have actively interfered with a lawful federal operation. Captain Walsh was assigned to Cedar Creek Medical as part of a DoD protection detail maintaining custody of a classified witness. Your written complaints about her performance, your restrictions on her access to room 347, your decision to have her forcibly removed by local police, all of this constitutes obstruction of a federal investigation. There are also indications that you received financial compensation from Summit Defense contractors in exchange for monitoring the patient's medical status and alerting them if his condition deteriorated beyond their acceptable parameters. That makes you a material witness to a conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended careers. The nurse who had been filming immediately uploaded the footage, 23 minutes of unbroken video showing Mercer's collapse, his voice climbing, his hand starting to tremble, the general's still silhouette in dress blues, the colonel watching with eyes clear as glass, Margaret standing motionless while her entire world shifted back into focus. The caption was 5 words, "Doctor humiliates decorated war hero." By noon, the video had 40,000 shares. By evening, it had reached Johns Hopkins Medical Center, where it landed in the inbox of Dr. Harrison Wheel, the man who had mentored Marcus Mercer through his fellowship, who had written his recommendation letters, who had vouched for his character and integrity to every institution that had hired him. Wheel watched his protégé berate a Silver Star recipient. Watched Mercer's contempt for a woman who had taken 3 bullets protecting a patient. Watched the moment when everything his former student was supposed to be revealed itself as a lie. At 8:14 p.m., Will made a phone call to the Georgia Medical Board. I'm requesting an immediate ethics investigation into Dr. Marcus Mercer's professional conduct and his financial relationship with defense contractors. I'm also recommending that Johns Hopkins revoke his affiliation and alumni status. I don't know the man in that video. I can't have him associated with my institution. By the time federal agents arrived with a search warrant at 6:06 p.m., they already had everything they needed. Margaret had left a USB drive in a locker marked with her old call sign, 6 months of documented billing fraud, phantom procedures, inflated insurance claims, phone records connecting Mercer to Summit Defense's liaison officer. The encrypted phone showed messages coordinating the assault team. Patient status update. Still conscious. Recommend terminal action within 48 hours. Approved. Payment processed upon completion. The tactical team that had tried to kill the colonel. The coordination. The money. All of it traced back to a single source, a surgeon who thought he was untouchable because he wore a white coat and had a hospital parking space with his name on it. They escorted him from his office in handcuffs at 6:58 p.m. while staff recorded every moment. His lawyer's first call was to Wheel, begging for a character reference. Wheel's response arrived via email within 6 minutes, 2 sentences that would follow Mercer through every courtroom, every parole hearing, every attempt to rebuild the life he had systematically dismantled himself. I don't know the man I saw in that video. I will be recommending Johns Hopkins revoke his affiliation and alumni status. The medical board moved with unusual speed, a surgeon actively interfering with a federal witness protection operation, collaborating with contractors trying to assassinate a military officer, coordinating with an assault team. No hospital would defend him. No institution would claim him. His surgical privileges were suspended pending trial within 72 hours. His wife filed for separation. The hospital removed his name from the donor wall where his family's $500,000 contribution had been prominently displayed. When the donors committee met to discuss replacing it with a patient testimonial, someone suggested putting up a photograph of Captain Margaret Walsh instead, the nurse who had saved a patient's life twice, once in Baghdad and once in a hospital lobby while bleeding out from 3 bullet wounds. The vote was unanimous. 6 months later, on a morning when spring had finally arrived in Arlington with the kind of gentle light that makes you believe in renewal, Margaret knelt before a white marble headstone. Her dress blues pressed a crease across her shoulders. Her left arm had healed to a point where most people wouldn't notice the slight limitation in range, though she would always know. Another scar to match the collection: Fallujah, Kandahar, Baghdad, Savannah. A map of her life written in tissue and memory. The headstone read, SSGT Carlos Ramos, United States Air Force, 1984 to 2018. She removed the folded flag from her jacket pocket, the flag she had carried for 6 years, the one she had pressed against her heart every time she thought about a moment when she couldn't save everyone, when the choice had been made for her by men with orders and logistics. She knelt and placed it carefully on the freshly turned earth, and for the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge that he was finally at rest. A military chaplain conducted the belated honors ceremony that Ramos's family had been denied because his death occurred during a classified operation, soldiers in dress uniform, rifles raised, taps echoing across the cemetery like a prayer carried on wind. The following week, at Cedar Creek Medical's main auditorium, the colonel stood before a gathering of staff, Pentagon officials, and the nurses who had watched Margaret eat lunch alone for 6 months while their phones remained silent. His arm was fully recovered. His testimony had secured indictments against 17 individuals in the defense contractor fraud network. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of someone who had been on the other side of death and had looked directly at the person who pulled him back. Captain Margaret Ellen Walsh, he said. Front and center. She rose from her chair in dress blues, Major Margaret Walsh now, promoted in a ceremony that had happened in a conference room with witnesses but no photographers, and walked forward while the entire hospital watched. He took her hand. With the other, he pinned the rank insignia to her collar, the gold oak leaf catching light like fire. Then he raised his sleeve. Block letters, dark and permanent, Walsh. She performed a field thoracotomy on me with a combat knife in Baghdad while under direct fire, he told the audience. She saved my life then. She took 3 bullets for me at this hospital. She is the definition of a soldier. And if any of you ever treated her as anything less, you were standing next to a legend and didn't even know it. The room erupted. Applause, cheers, phones raised. Margaret stood at the center of it, her expression unchanged, her composure absolute, her weight perfectly balanced on both feet. She had spent her entire military career being invisible, and now she was standing under lights while everyone looked. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply nodded once, the way soldiers do when acknowledging orders, when accepting their role in something larger than themselves. The hospital administrator offered her the position of Director of Emergency Medicine. She declined with a slight smile. I'm needed elsewhere. 200 miles away, in a rural clinic where the lights never quite seemed bright enough, Dr. Mercer loaded medical supplies into a van with the words Cedar Creek Medical Equipment Services stenciled on the side. His ankle monitor beeped a reminder of his 8 p.m. curfew. His medical license restricted to non-surgical practice. His 15-year career reduced to inventory management and equipment delivery. Some nights he wondered if the nurses at Cedar Creek thought about him, if they understood what it meant that he had once stood where he had stood. Mostly he loaded boxes and tried not to think about anything at all. That evening, Margaret arrived at a VA hospital in Atlanta, where her next assignment waited, another patient, another mission, another chance to serve without recognition. She pinned a small flag patch inside her new locker, thinking of Ramos, thinking of the colonel, thinking of all the lives worth saving in silence. Her commanding officer asked if she was ready. She nodded once, and the words that came out of her mouth carried the weight of everything she had learned, everything she had survived, everything she understood about the nature of true strength. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Subscribe for more stories of people who operate in the shadows, who make impossible choices, who save lives without ever expecting anyone to know their names. Like this video if you believe the quietest people in the room sometimes carry the heaviest weight.